The winter didn't just freeze the land that morning, it froze hope itself. The cemetery lay silent beneath a thick blanket of snow, the kind of silence that presses against your chest until breathing feels like work. In the middle of it stood a woman, alone, swinging a shovel against ground that hadn't softened in weeks. She was losing a battle she already knew she couldn't win. Beside her rested a small wooden coffin, painfully light, painfully final. Too small for the kind of grief it carried. Her hands trembled with exhaustion, her tears froze on her cheeks before they could fall. Still, she kept digging. Because when the world takes everything from you, pride becomes the last thing you cling to. From a distance, a lone rider noticed her. He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't looking to change a life. He was just riding the fence line of his ranch, thinking about feed, weather, and survival. But some moments don't ask permission. They demand to be seen. By the end of that day, a child would be laid to rest, a woman's walls would begin to crumble, and two strangers would discover that kindness, real kindness, has the power to thaw even the coldest grief. Some stories begin with loss. The rare ones grow into something more. Ethan Cole had worked the northern boundary of his ranch for nearly 2 decades, but the prairie had never looked this unforgiving. The cold cut deep, the kind that settled into bone and stayed there. Snow stretched endlessly across the land, unbroken except for fence posts and the occasional drift shaped by the wind. His horse moved carefully, hooves cracking through the crusted snow. Ethan's thoughts were practical: hay reserves, calving season, the storm predicted for the following night. Wyoming winters didn't allow room for distraction. Then he saw her. A dark figure stood out starkly against the white landscape, near the small valley cemetery that most folks avoided in winter. Even from a distance, something about the scene felt wrong. Ethan slowed his horse, narrowing his eyes against the glare of sunlight reflecting off the snow. The figure moved again, jerky, uneven motions. Digging. That alone made no sense. The ground had been frozen solid for over a month. Men avoided burial if they could, waiting for spring whenever possible. He turned his horse toward the cemetery. As he drew closer, details sharpened. A woman. Thin. Bent forward with exhaustion. Each swing of the shovel struck the earth with a dull, hopeless sound. The ground refused to give. And then he saw it. A small pine coffin rested beside her, dusted with snow. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He dismounted quietly, leading his horse the last few yards. The wind carried sound away, and she didn't notice him at first. Her focus was absolute grim determination fueled by something deeper than strength. When she raised the shovel again, her arms shook violently. The blade rang against frozen earth, sending a visible jolt through her body. She staggered, caught herself, and lifted the shovel once more. "Ma'am," Ethan said gently. She spun around, shovel raised defensively. Her face was pale, hollowed by grief and exhaustion. Tears streaked her cheeks, frozen in place. Dark circles framed eyes that looked far older than her years. "I don't need help," she said. Her voice cracked despite her effort to keep it steady. Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked at the coffin. At her blistered hands. At the impossible ground beneath their feet. "You can't do this alone," he said quietly. She shook her head fiercely. "I have to." Ethan stepped forward slowly, careful not to startle her. "Let me," he said, reaching for the shovel. For a moment, he thought she would fight him. Instead, her fingers loosened. The shovel slipped from her grasp as if she'd been waiting for permission to let go. Her arms fell to her sides. Ethan positioned himself and drove the shovel into the earth with all his strength. The blade resisted, then cracked through the frozen surface just enough to matter. He worked methodically, breathing hard, sweat freezing at the base of his neck despite the cold. Each inch came at a cost. Behind him, the woman sank to her knees beside the coffin. She placed one trembling hand on the rough wood, as if grounding herself in its reality. An hour passed in silence. The only sounds were the shovel striking earth, the wind whispering through bare cottonwood branches, and Ethan's labored breathing. His shoulders burned. His hands went numb. Still, he dug. The sound of approaching horses finally broke the quiet. Ethan looked up to see two of his ranch hands, Caleb Morales and Henry Price, riding in. One glance told them everything they needed to know. Without a word, Caleb dismounted and retrieved a pickaxe from his saddle. Henry followed suit. 3 men worked the frozen ground for a child they had never known. One woman knelt beside a daughter she would never watch grow. Slowly, the grave deepened. 2 feet. Then 3. Enough. Caleb removed his hat first. The others followed. The wind seemed to hush. The woman Margaret Lawson, Ethan realized, stood on legs that trembled violently. She bent and lifted the coffin. It was heartbreakingly light. Ethan stepped forward instinctively, but she shook her head. "I need to do this," she whispered. She knelt at the edge and lowered the coffin into the earth with shaking arms. It settled with a soft, final sound that echoed louder than thunder in Ethan's chest. Margaret remained there, lips moving silently. Ethan reached into his coat and pulled out the small Bible he carried everywhere. His hands were stiff with cold as he opened it. "If it's all right," he said. She nodded once. Ethan read softly, words of comfort he barely felt worthy to speak. Verses about lambs gathered in loving arms. About the broken-hearted not being forgotten. Margaret's shoulders began to shake. When the sobs came, they came hard. The men filled the grave gently, shaping the mound with care. Caleb fashioned a simple wooden cross. Henry set it firmly into the frozen ground. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the temperature dropped fast. Ethan turned to Margaret. "Where's your place?" 2 miles east, she said distantly. "I'll make sure you get home safe." This time, she didn't argue. Ethan followed at a respectful distance as Margaret rode east, her posture rigid in the saddle. The sun sank low behind them, setting the snow ablaze with streaks of amber and rose that felt cruelly beautiful for a day like this. Wind scraped across the prairie, lifting fine crystals of snow that stung exposed skin. Margaret's cabin appeared like a stubborn afterthought against the hillside, small, weather-beaten, built where the land might break the worst of the wind. Smoke threaded from the chimney, thin but steady. She dismounted stiffly and led her horse to the rail, movements careful, mechanical. She did not look back. Ethan waited until lamplight glowed in the window. Only then did he turn his horse toward home, the image of the small coffin lowering into frozen earth replaying with each step. Inside, Margaret sat at her table without removing her coat. The room smelled of wood smoke and cold. Her hands lay flat on the scarred surface, fingers numb, mind blank. 3 days ago, Anna had been alive, burning with fever, breathing fast but breathing. Margaret had ridden through the dark, 8 miles to town, the baby wrapped tight against her chest. Dr. Whitaker had come back with her, clucking with concern, promising rest and remedies. By dawn, Anna's breathing had changed. By sunrise, it had stopped. The doctor had been gentle. He'd helped wash the tiny body, wrapped her in clean linen, and offered words Margaret barely heard. He promised to send word to neighbors. January, he'd said, was hard on everyone. Margaret had understood. She always did. 14 months earlier, her husband Samuel had died under a fallen timber. At first, people came, meals, condolences, offers to help. Frontier kindness was real, but it had a horizon. The winter stretched long, everyone had their own animals to feed, their own roofs to keep standing. Eventually, the help thinned, then stopped. Margaret learned to do everything herself. She mended fence with hands that blistered and bled. She hauled water from the creek until her shoulders ached. When she discovered she was pregnant, grief tangled with gratitude. A piece of Samuel still lived. Fear followed close behind, but she refused to let it win. Anna arrived in May, delivered by a midwife who stayed 2 days and left them alone together. It had been enough. More than enough. Yesterday, Margaret had built the coffin herself. She measured twice, cut once, using pine boards Samuel had saved for a crib. The irony landed hard and stayed. She lined it with fabric from her wedding dress, careful stitches she'd learned as a girl. If she couldn't give her daughter a future, she would give her beauty. She had believed she could dig the grave alone. Tonight, the belief felt like another thing she had buried. She rose slowly, shrugging out of her coat, and fed the stove until the iron glowed. Heat licked the room, but the cold inside her remained. Tomorrow would come. The day after that, a long line of mornings without Anna's breath in the room. The next day dawned bright and wrong. Fresh snow glittered under a clean sky, as if the world had decided to start over without asking. Margaret stepped outside to the sound of wheels on packed snow. Ethan's wagon rolled into view, stacked high with split firewood and a sack tied at the back. He reined in, touched the brim of his hat. "Morning," he said. "Thought you might be running low." "I have enough," Margaret replied automatically. "Then you'll have more," he said, already climbing down. He unloaded without fuss, stacking wood neatly along the cabin wall. Margaret watched, pride prickling, then moved to help. He didn't stop her. They worked in silence, breath fogging the air. When the wagon was empty, Ethan glanced at the barn. "Your door's hanging crooked." "Hinge broke," she said. "I've been meaning to fix it." He nodded. "Show me where the tools are." He worked efficiently, replacing the hinge with one from Samuel's old kit. The door swung true. Margaret swallowed. "Thank you." "Coffee?" he asked. Inside, they sat at the table. The same table. The pot steamed. They drank quietly. "Your cattle look thin," Ethan said gently. "You've got enough hay to get through." "Enough," she said, then hesitated. "Probably." "I've got surplus," he said. "I'll bring some over." "No charge." She wanted to refuse. Pride rose like a shield. But pride didn't feed animals. "That's generous," she said instead. They sat a while longer. The quiet didn't press this time, it rested. "My sister died young," Ethan said finally. "Scarlet fever." "I remember my father digging the grave. Thinking the ground shouldn't be so hard for someone so small." "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered. "Long time ago," he said. "You don't forget." He left with the same quiet purpose he'd arrived with. Margaret stood at the window until the wagon disappeared beyond the rise. The cabin felt less hollow for having held another voice. 3 days later, Ethan returned with hay. The week after, lamp oil and coffee. He repaired a fence section torn by wind. A pattern formed: practical reasons, brief visits, shared work. He never overstayed. never asked questions she couldn't answer. Margaret found herself listening for the wagon on the days he didn't come. The waiting surprised her. One afternoon, Ethan noticed the fiddle on the wall. "You play?" "I used to," she said, then took it down. Her fingers were stiff, but memory guided them. The tune was simple, something her mother had taught her. The sound filled the cabin, chasing corners of silence. When she finished, Ethan smiled. "That's fine playing." She played another. And another. When he left, she realized she'd smiled briefly, unexpectedly. February arrived with treacherous calm. Days warmed just enough to melt snow, nights froze it into glass. Ethan's visits became expected, welcomed. They talked more about horses bred for cold, about books she loved, about weather and spring. Grief didn't vanish. It learned to share space. On February 15th, the sky darkened early. Ethan saw the wall of cloud building in the northwest and turned his horse hard toward Margaret's place. Snow began to fall, thick and fast. Margaret was outside, cattle scattering in the rising wind. Ethan dismounted and joined her without a word. Together, they worked steady, determined, driving the herd into the barn as the storm roared to life. Snow slammed the walls. The wind screamed. "You can't ride home in this," Margaret said. "I'll wait it out in the barn." "Don't be foolish," she said. "Come inside." They ran for the cabin, bent against the gale, and shut the door on the storm. Outside, the blizzard howled. Inside, a fire burned. And something quiet, fragile began to take shape. The blizzard owned the night. Snow hurled itself against the cabin walls, the wind rising and falling like a living thing. Inside, the fire snapped and hissed, throwing light across the rough-hewn room. Ethan hung his coat near the stove, steam lifting as the ice began to melt. Margaret poured coffee with steady hands she didn't quite trust. "Storm like this might last till morning," Ethan said. Margaret nodded. "Happens." They sat at the table, listening to the roar outside. The cabin felt smaller with another person in it, but not cramped, anchored. For the first time in weeks, Margaret noticed the sound of her own breathing. "You can take the bed," she said after a moment. "I'll make up a pallet." "No," Ethan said, gentle but firm. "I'll sleep by the stove. I've done worse." She didn't argue. The idea of company through the night eased something in her chest she hadn't known was tight. Hours passed. The wind battered the world into a blur. Margaret woke once, heart racing, certain she'd heard Anna cry. The sound faded into the storm. She sat up, wrapped in her blanket, until the feeling passed. At dawn, the blizzard broke. Silence followed, vast and clean. Snow lay deep against the cabin, the world reshaped. Ethan shoveled a path while Margaret tended the animals. They worked without speaking, hands moving in practiced rhythm. Inside again, she broke bread they'd shared the night before. It tasted better than it should have. "Thank you," she said, and meant more than the meal. Ethan smiled. "Any time." Spring inched closer. Days lengthened. Snow softened. Ethan came as he always had: hay to stack, fences to mend, but something else threaded their time together now. He laughed more easily. Margaret talked without measuring every word. One afternoon, they sat on the steps, sun warming their faces. Margaret spoke of Missouri, of her father's schoolhouse, of poetry read aloud in summer shade. Ethan listened, hands folded, eyes thoughtful. "Read me something," he said. She fetched a book and read until the light shifted and the wind eased. When she finished, Ethan was quiet a long moment. "Feels like it makes room," he said. "For things to be hard and still beautiful." Margaret nodded. "That's what it does for me." The first hint of green showed by March. Calving season kept Ethan busy, but he still came. He brought a small carved stone one evening, simple, smooth. "For Anna," he said. Margaret's breath caught. She traced the name with her thumb. "Thank you." They placed it together when the ground softened enough to take it. The prairie wind moved the grass like water. Margaret stood longer than she meant to, then turned away. "I don't want to forget," she said. "You won't," Ethan replied. "But you don't have to be alone." She looked at him then, really looked. The steadiness. The kindness that never asked for payment. "I'm afraid," she said. "So am I," he said, and smiled. The days grew warmer. Work lightened. One evening, Ethan stayed later than usual. They shared supper. Laughter came easily now, a sound Margaret welcomed without guilt. When he left, he paused at the door. "Maggie," he said, using her name for the first time. "I'm glad I rode past that cemetery." "So am I," she said. After he went, Margaret stood in the quiet and felt the truth of it settle, not erasing grief, not replacing it, but standing beside it. Hope didn't shout. It waited. Spring arrived the way it always did on the high plains, cautious, unreliable, and stubborn. Snow retreated in patches, clinging to the shaded places as if reluctant to leave. The earth softened enough to accept seeds, and the air carried the promise of growth that felt almost indecent after such a hard winter. Ethan came less often, though not because he wanted to. Calving season consumed his days and many of his nights. When he did arrive, his visits were shorter, purposeful. He'd tip his hat, check the fences or the hay, and linger only long enough to share coffee and a few words. Margaret missed him more than she expected. She told herself it was practical. There was always work to be done, and he was good at it. Still, on days he didn't come, the cabin felt larger, emptier. She filled the time with chores, planting a small kitchen garden, mending clothes, sanding the table where winter had left its mark. One afternoon, she walked the path to the cemetery alone. The ground had finally softened enough to take a proper marker. She knelt and cleared weeds from around Anna's stone, the small carved letters catching the sun. "I'm trying," she said softly. "I hope that's enough." A breeze lifted the grass. Somewhere nearby, a meadowlark sang. Margaret stood, brushed dirt from her knees, and felt steadier than she had in months. Ethan arrived that evening, dust on his boots and fatigue etched into his posture. He accepted the coffee with a grateful nod and sank into a chair. "Long day," he said. "Long season," she replied. He smiled. "That too." They sat companionably, watching the light change through the window. Margaret realized she had something to say and didn't want to miss the moment. "I was thinking," she began, then paused. "I could help. At your place. Cooking, maybe. For your hands." Ethan looked surprised, then pleased. "They'd be grateful. Might save us from burned beans." She laughed. "I make no promises." The first evening she came to the ranch, the men greeted her with cautious curiosity that melted quickly into appreciation. Food had a way of doing that. The kitchen filled with warmth and noise. Margaret moved among them with an ease she'd forgotten she possessed. Ethan watched from the doorway, something like wonder in his expression. As weeks passed, the arrangement became routine. Margaret cooked a few nights a week. Ethan walked her home when the light failed, the prairie stretching wide and open around them. They talked about small things and important ones, sometimes not at all. One night, under a sky stitched with stars, Ethan stopped. "Maggie," he said. "I don't want to rush anything." She met his gaze. "Neither do I. But I want you to know," he exhaled. "You matter to me." The words settled between them, solid and gentle. Margaret felt fear rise and then ease. "I know," she said. "You do to me, too." They didn't touch. They didn't need to. The truth was enough for that night. Summer came bright and fast, the garden flourished. Calves grew sturdy. Laughter found its way back into Margaret's days without apology. Grief still arrived unannounced, but it no longer owned the house. On a warm evening, Ethan brought news. "I've been thinking about expanding the south pasture," he said. "Could use your eye." She raised a brow. "My eye? You notice things," he said. "You see what others miss." They walked the land together, planning, imagining. The future took on a shape that felt possible. At the edge of the pasture, Ethan stopped. "There's something else," he said, voice steady but careful. "I don't want you to feel obligated. To me. To this." Margaret considered him the man who had dug in frozen ground, who had come back with firewood and silence and time. "I don't," she said. "I choose." He nodded, relief softening his features. They stood there, wind in the grass, the world wide open. Autumn arrived quietly, without ceremony. The heat faded, the light thinned, and the land shifted into a softer palette of gold and rust. Margaret noticed the change in herself before she named it, how she woke without bracing for the day, how the ache that once lived permanently behind her ribs now came and went. She had not forgotten Anna. She never would. Grief had simply learned where to sit. Ethan rode over one evening with a folded paper tucked into his coat. He set it on the table between them without comment. Margaret unfolded it carefully. A deed. A small parcel adjoining Ethan's south pasture, deeded into her name. "I won't accept this," she said at once. "I'm not giving it away," Ethan replied. "I'm investing. In you. In us. If you want." She studied him. "What if I say no?" "Then I'll tear it up," he said easily. "And we'll drink coffee like always." Margaret breathed out. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't," he said. "But it's honest." They walked that land together in the cooling light. Margaret imagined a larger garden, a few more animals, a life that felt chosen rather than endured. "Yes," she said finally. "On one condition." Ethan waited. "We build it slow," she said. "With room for memory." He smiled. "That's the only way I know." The first frost came early. They marked it by setting posts for a new fence, hands numb, breath visible. Work was work, but it was also conversation, plans and pauses, laughter when a post leaned crooked, patience when the ground resisted. On a clear afternoon, they returned to the cemetery. The grass had grown tall and soft around Anna's stone. Margaret knelt, brushing leaves away. Ethan stood back, hat in hand. "I thought love meant holding on," Margaret said. "I think now it also means letting the world keep going." Ethan nodded. "And carrying what matters." They left a small bouquet of wild flowers and walked away together. Winter returned, gentler this time. Snow fell without the old menace. The cabin held warmth and music again. Margaret played the fiddle, Ethan listened, eyes closed, content. One night, as the fire burned low, Ethan spoke. "I don't know what the future looks like," he said. "But I know I want to face it with you." Margaret reached for his hand. The contact felt natural, earned. "Me too," she said. Spring came early the following year. Calves dropped healthy. The garden overflowed. Neighbors noticed the change and drifted back in, meals shared, fences raised, laughter returning to the valley. On a bright morning, they stood on the porch, watching the light move across the land. Margaret leaned into Ethan's shoulder. "This place saved me," she said. Ethan shook his head gently. "You saved yourself. I just showed up." She smiled. "Sometimes that's everything." They walked down the steps and into the day, carrying what remained: love shaped by loss, hope earned by patience, and a kindness that had once broken frozen ground and now, finally, let something new grow.